From zero to lectin in 10 easy steps. Welcome to the depths. Welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lectin. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Today, I'm going to do a video that is the 10 books that made me. Now, this is a video that I saw CriminOlly do in late August, and I thought it was a great idea, so I am shamelessly stealing it from him. Though, to be fair, he did encourage other people to do the same thing. Why I think it's a great idea is that these aren't what I'm going to say are the 10 best books. These aren't the 10 best books I've read. These aren't the 10 books I think you should read. But for some reason, these 10 books had a role in influencing me as a person and as a reader and as developing my reading life. So I thought it is a fun way to kind of get a glimpse into what motivates me to read the way I do and to kind of exist the way I do in the world through literature. So hopefully you enjoy coming along on the ride. So with that, let's start. The first book on my list is actually a series, and it's the Hardy Boys series. These are the first books that I have a conscious memory of reading. Now, I know I read books before these, but these books I probably started reading somewhere in the end of first grade, second grade, as soon as I was able to kind of confidently and strongly read on my own. These are the first books that I have any strong memory of reading and really being addicted to. I remember like the first 50 in the series were all hardcover, like that kind of iconic royal blue hardcover, and then after that they're all paperback. And I just remember having bookshelves filled with these and reading them constantly. Every time, every holiday or birthday, I would get a gift certificate to Walden Books, which was the chain bookstore around me at the time, and immediately I'd go and get 2 new Hardy Boys novels. It really inspired a love for reading in me that I remember, but even more than that, like the love of mystery. Like these are such great mystery detective stories for young adults, and I'm sure they're dated. I'm sure if you read the old ones, they're full of racism and misogyny. Like I wouldn't be surprised with that, but they really cemented in me this love for sleuthing and for trying to figure something out. You feel smarter reading it because you can read around the clues and you can do the work. And so for a young mind to be really enamored with that was important. And so these were really influential in my reading journey. They're the first things I remember doing, and they incited a love for mystery and for like using your brain to solve something and to feel proud of yourself and smart for having accomplished something at the end. And it just sparked like this idea of confidence in me that I would be able to solve problems on my own if they came up. So that was the first book, the Hardy Boys series. And the next one is also a series. These are the Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine. And now, I was born in 84. The Goosebumps series came out in 91, I think. So I started reading them right away. They weren't the first books by R.L. Stine that I read. I actually read some of his Fear Street series before these. But these I really latched onto, and they cemented my love for horror. It was like that dark embrace that just gripped my heart and has not let go since. So I really can trace my love for horror as a genre back to the R.L. Stine books. And so not only were these like my gateway drug to horror, but at the same time, what they did for me was a little bit secondary to the books themselves, but there was a TV show at the time. It was a children's fantasy TV show with puppets, like Jim Henson style puppets. It was called Eureka's Castle. And I don't remember anything about the show, except that during the credits, I saw that it had been written by R.L. Stine, or created by R.L. Stine. And I realized that the same person that created the Goosebumps books also created this TV show. And they were so wildly different that blew my young mind. That like one person could contain within them the capacity to create so many different things. And actually, I bet if you look back at it, they aren't that wildly different. But to, young me, the idea of this children's fantasy show and these Goosebumps books was like leagues apart. So something about reading the Goosebumps book with the appreciation that R.L. Stine could also create wildly different types of art and literature really spoke to me. But more importantly, it cemented my love for horror. And it kind of set me strongly on a genre path. And that leads into my third book, which is Misery by Stephen King. And it seems like there's a big jump between the Goosebumps books, which are middle grade horror, and Stephen King. But for me, there wasn't a big jump because I was given Stephen King when I was 10 years old, and Misery was the first book that I read by him. And the adults around me were happy that I was reading. They knew I was reading way above my age range. And so someone handed me Stephen King and they said, here you go. And they were all just happy that I was reading. So no one really paid attention to what I read. Maybe there was a little bit of benign neglect on the part of my teachers and, my mother and so forth. There's no way that a 10-year-old should be reading Stephen King. Like, Misery is not a book for a child. And then the next book I read by Stephen King was Gerald's Game, which is even more like not appropriate for children. Yet when I read Misery for the first time, it was like a transformative experience because I already knew that I loved being scared. I loved the thrill of horror and the ability to look at something that terrifies you, look at your trauma, look at your pain in a safe space where you can overpower it, which is like one of the benefits of horror as a genre. I already knew that. And Stephen King just turned it all up a notch. I don't know that Misery is my favorite Stephen King story. Actually, that's not true. I know that it isn't my favorite Stephen King story, but reading it really just transformed the way I thought of myself as a reader, because it was when I first thought of myself as reading adult literature. It gave me a sense of pride. It gave me a sense probably of superiority, which isn't necessarily healthy, but it is what it is. And it was the first time that I felt bigger than myself. Do you know what I mean? And so just that like sense of pride, that sense of accomplishment is really associated with me reading Misery by Stephen King, since it was my first adult book. And it was the time when I transitioned from going to the children's section of the library into the adult section of the library. And it really just, if R.L. Stine like lit the fire of my love for horror, Stephen King was just like an explosion. So that is the third book on my list. The fourth book is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and this could easily be exchanged with 1984 by George Orwell. I'm pretty sure I read both of them at the same time, like fourth, fifth grade, and they kind of fulfilled the same role in my reading journey, which is that they are both these like light science fiction near future dystopias, which are not that dissimilar to our own. And reading them, what they really showed me was that a few things. One, I realized like you could have a political and social message in your fiction, which I guess I hadn't realized before. And of course, they pre-existed even in Stephen King's work. Like look at something like, The Long Walk, which was Stephen King's response to the Vietnam War and the way that we're just sending young men to die for no reason. So obviously there's social commentary in genre fiction that I just wasn't clued into because I was so young. I must have been in third, fourth grade by the time I read Ray Bradbury for the first time. And so it really inspired in me this realization that social and political critique could be embedded in fiction. It wasn't just for pure entertainment. So that's when I realized that there was more going on in these texts than I had previously thought. And so it opened up the world of literature to me in a way that became really meaningful. And also, something about both Fahrenheit 451 and 1984 is it shows like the dangers of a authoritarian, malevolent political entity. And what it did for me to some extent was it showed you that the people that are supposed to be in charge don't have your best interest at heart. That you have to take care of yourself because the ones that are supposed to be helping you probably won't. And if anything, they might actually actively hurt you because they only care about themselves. And arguably that can send the wrong message to someone. But for me, as like a young queer person who didn't really have any friends, I had a loving family support network, but I didn't really have anything outside of that. I felt ostracized and othered. I looked at this and I said, this means it's my responsibility to take care of myself. It is my responsibility to find my own happiness. It is my responsibility to find my own justice. And it really empowered me in a way. It pulled the wool out from over my eyes where I didn't think I was going to be saved by someone outside of me. And in fact, the people outside of me, the people in power, were probably going to use that power to try to control me or manipulate me in some way. And in fourth or fifth grade, whenever it was that I read this, it really ignited in me like a sense of empowerment and a sense of confidence that I have to rely on myself because I'm responsible for my own well-being in the world, which is motivating to me. Then the next book on my list, number 5, is Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. This was not the first book I read by Kurt Vonnegut, but what this did, along with a lot of his other work, is it showed me the power of satire, that not everything had to be realistic, and that there's something in laughter and in making fun of something that is really powerful. And this book also is like surreal, and he writes himself in, so there's this meta aspect of it. And I just remember reading it and cracking up, finding it so hilarious, yet at the same time, it's clear that Vonnegut always has a social message, an anti-war message, a slightly anti-capitalist message through almost all of his books. So he's using that spoonful of sugar, but he's giving you the medicine at the same time. And I had never experienced it that way. All the books that I thought contained like weighty, important messages, I didn't find them also funny. Like I never laughed out loud at any of them. Not in the way I did with Vonnegut. So Vonnegut really inspired in me this realization that humor and satire is a weapon of survival in many situations. So I really appreciated it for that regard. Then the next book, number 6, would be Invisible Monsters by Chuck Palahniuk. I know it seems pretty fun these days to rag on Chuck Palahniuk and to hate on Chuck Palahniuk. And I will say that a lot of his newer work hasn't spoken to me. I don't think I've even read his most recent novel. And the few before that I think basically since Haunted, I have not been bowled over by them, let's say. But the early work really blew me away. You know, A Fight Club, Invisible Monsters, Diary, Lullaby, Choke, Pygmy, Oral History of Rant Casey. All of these books were really profound for me as a young man. And I had read Fight Club first. That was the first book I read from him right after the movie came out. So I must have been around 15. And Invisible Monsters was the second one I read. I just thought it was such a powerfully aggressive and transgressive book. It was the first time I'd read this kind of transgression in fiction, and it was so loud and in your face and unapologetically queer, and like a giant middle finger to all of the people that are telling you you can't be what you want to be. And so I found it liberating in so many ways, and I found liberation in transgressive fiction in a large part thanks to Chuck Palahniuk. And at the time, Chuck Palahniuk wasn't very open about being queer, but as soon as I read Fight Club the first time, you read it and you realize it's a queer text, and the transgression of it lines up with queer politics in many important ways. And so I knew this was a queer text, and then reading Invisible Monsters and having it be so explicitly queer and in your face, it kind of let me see myself in fiction in a way that I hadn't seen before. And I don't resemble any of the characters in Invisible Monsters in terms of my own life story, but it just put something in front of me that was anti-authoritarian, that was transgressive, that was dark, that was still funny, that was like a giant middle finger to authority, and yet took care of itself. Like, the book is very loving, and it has a found family that care about each other deeply. And so it spoke to me in many different ways. And so Chuck Palahniuk's work, his early work, was really important for me in that way. And Invisible Monsters, I think, is like the epitome of that. Now, the next one is a little bit of a left turn, or maybe not, I guess, but this is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And the truth is, The Lottery is a perfect story. And it's hard, once you've read The Lottery or know The Lottery, to think what it was like before you'd read The Lottery. But The Lottery is so terrifying, right? And it is so contained, and yet it tells one of the most terrifying stories where the only terrifying force is humanity, and it is your neighbor, right? That is what is so frightening about it. And the switch from the facade of being caring and compassionate to the inherent violence in the self-cherishing mind and of caring about yourself more than others, that is very gruesomely enacted upon such a sympathetic character in the story. One of the things that was so profound for me reading is that it's so short, right? To be able to contain such an amazingly broad story that explores humanity in such a short way, and to be so terrifying in so few words. I don't remember having that sensation from a short story before that. It blew me away in being able to have like a pinpoint focus on humanity as the monster, and how easy it is to switch from being neighbor to being enemy. Yeah, it was really terrifying. So that's why The Lottery gets my number 7 pick. Number 8 is The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. And I must have been 16 or so when I read this. I didn't read this until the movies had been announced, Peter Jackson's movies, and then I wanted to read it before the movies came out. I had read The Hobbit when I was young, and I enjoyed it, but for some reason, at this point, when I was 15, 16, 17, I was so full of myself that I was convinced that fantasy was like a genre for children, and that there wasn't anything there because I was an adult. I was reading adult fiction, which is, the foolishness of youth. But so I had kind of written off fantasy as being something that wasn't interesting to me and that didn't matter. When I heard this movie was coming out and I knew it was well loved, so I said, okay, I want to read these before the movie comes out. And I bought the trilogy, like one giant paperback that had all 3 of them, and I read all 3 of them back to back, and they blew me away. And I think what really took my breath away was how immersive it was, and how you fell into that world and you fell into Middle Earth in such a way that it felt real, and you could get lost in it. And for all the things I'd read before there, and as much as I'd identified myself with the story, and as much as it felt relatable, I don't remember feeling lost or immersed in a world the way I did in Middle Earth and in that fantasy story. And so it really, on one hand, it kind of reminded me of how foolish I was and how much I didn't know, and that by limiting myself to saying I was above this genre, I was really cutting myself off from like amazing opportunities for adventure and fun and growth. But on top of that, it just showed me what it means to have really stellar world building where you feel immediately lost in this world, part of this world, and let that kind of overtake you in a way that really made reading for me even more enjoyable, to realize that there is a way to enter and engage into a story in like a more profound way than I'd been used to. Now, the last 2 are books that I read in college. So we've moved on from high school now. So now we're in college. And the first one is Gynecology, The Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism by Mary Daly. And I read this as a freshman. Actually, I was assigned like one chapter of it for a class, and I ended up reading the whole thing. And, I had been engaged in social justice and advocacy work in high school. And so the idea of social justice work and equality work wasn't new to me, but I had never read any literature. I'd never read any critique or any philosophy on it. And this book I felt it was so rigorous in terms of its scholarship, but also in terms of its creativity. And it was like a hard book for me to read. Like I didn't understand it right away. I had to keep rereading things, and it forced me to question myself and how I understood the world around me in a way that I don't think I'd been forced to question before. It forced me to question ideas of what it was to be a man, what it was to like perform gender. And though I suppose some of that really came from reading Judith Butler as well. But it was the first time I remember reading critical scholarship on an issue that was important to me. I don't think before then I would have ever identified as a feminist or even understood what that meant for a man to be a feminist. And this kind of shook me out of the tree to see the inherent power structures of patriarchy and misogyny that kind of underlie so much of our everyday existence. Now, I don't know how well this holds up. It was written in the late 70s, and gender studies and the way we talk about gender has changed a lot in the last 50 years. And now I would probably, Mary Daly isn't the first philosopher or scholar I turn to. I find myself more often returning to Angela Davis or other people like that. But this really was the first one I'd ever read that really turned my head around in a way, and it shook me like in a really profound and meaningful way. So I'm really grateful to it for that. Before reading this, I just didn't have a concept of the power of scholasticism or of like philosophical rigor when applying to like real life problems. And so for that alone, it transformed my understanding of what you can do in text and how text works as a vehicle for transforming minds, Okay, and the last book on my list of the 10 books that made me is going to be a little bit of a cop-out, but go with me. And it is The Collected Plays of William Shakespeare. And the reason it's a little bit of a cop-out, and I'm not going to just choose one, is because it isn't a single play that moved me in any way. But, I had read Shakespeare in high school. I think most high school students do. I'd read, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, Midsummer Night's Dream. And I guess I understood them as well as a 16-year-old can understand them when being taught by someone who also only barely understands them, even in like AP English classes. And so I had like an intellectual understanding of the importance of Shakespeare and an intellectual appreciation of it, but I didn't have any experiential appreciation. And then in college, I have my undergraduate degrees. I have a degree in theater as well as religion. And so as part of my theater degree, I took an elective that was just on Shakespeare in the English department. And it was a lecture course. So it was 3 classes a week, 150 students. It wasn't like a personal seminar. But the professor loved Shakespeare. The professor had written his PhD on Shakespeare. His whole area of study was Shakespeare and Victorian literature. And the amount that he loved this material was so infectious that I began to love Shakespeare. And I began to have this experience of finding joy in Shakespeare that I had never had before. And so just critically looking at Shakespeare, you realize that it contains everything. You want horror, go ahead and look at the witches at the beginning of Macbeth and tell me that isn't horror. You want fantasy, look at all of Midsummer Night's Dream and tell me that isn't fantasy. You want political thriller, you want espionage, you want melodrama, you want any genre or any aspect of social critique or political critique or tawdry humor. It's all there. Shakespeare is able to contain all of it in such beautiful language at that. So just on a technical level, I became appreciative of how masterful he was at his craft and how any given piece of literature can contain so many multitudes at once. But maybe more important is that due to my experience of reading it in this particular class with this professor, I realized the power of joy when teaching and the fact that I was able to experience an appreciation for Shakespeare solely due to this professor's profound love for the topic was really moving to me. And it's something that has really stuck with me over the last 20 years, that it isn't only the content, but also the presentation of the content that matters when you're learning, when you're studying, when you're teaching. And I suppose that's common sense, right? That's why hype men exist. Like, it makes sense that if someone likes something, they can draw you over to their side on it. But I hadn't really applied that idea to literature or to study before this time. And so there was just something about that experience of reading these classic texts that I thought were so far outside of my realm of experience, that didn't have anything to do with my life, and that I thought were like old and stodgy and beautiful language that I would never understand and therefore not important, to be able to read them anew through the lens of someone that was so infatuated and dedicated to these texts, and then to find in them myself, to find my own story, to find my own joys, my own sorrow, my own grief, my own horror, everything about me, all the multitudes that make up who I am are in those texts. To find them, thanks to the joy of another person's reading style and teaching style, was really groundbreaking for me and really monumental. And it shaped how I try to share texts, how I try to teach, how I try to be in the world. Is if I lead with joy, then I want others to experience the same thing I'm experiencing. And the best way to do that is to unabashedly love what it is you're talking about, and to let your joy and your love and your appreciation be infectious. Okay, I think I'm going to end there. So those are the 10 books that made me, or at least the 10 I happened to choose for this video. So what about you? What are the 10 books that you would find most important in your life? And what about my 10? Do you share any of them? Did any of them have any impact on you? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. But for now, thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.